Two.
Hello and welcome in to the Mike and Mike podcast here this morning. Coming to you live and back and better than ever. We're here this morning after a short 2 month sabbatical where we had to deal with a few things going on. Michael had a bunch of stuff happening there with some of the expansion stuff at Team Modern, and year-end stuff's always fun here in the brokerage world. So we finally got ourselves back together a little bit so that we could be a little bit more regular here providing content to you all. The most amazing thing I can tell you about our sabbatical is how many people out there are actually listening to this and asking when we were going to get back together. So I'm blown away by that. So thank you, all of you that are listening and tuning in, and hopefully we can get back on the train and earn your viewership to the next podcast. So, Michael, how is everything at the great expansion of Somerset? And are y'all coming back down yet?
It feels like more than 2 months. I promise you that. But everything's well. Very blessed. We are not the GameStop of Bible study podcast. This is not fake demand. There's real demand out there, Mike.
There you go. There you go. So again, we're thankful you're here. Thankful you're tuning in with us today. Given a few different things going on that Michael and I have experienced over the last little bit in the workplace and looking at some situations, we thought this morning we could turn our attention to what do you do from a corporate leadership standpoint? Remember the intent of the podcast is how do we use biblical principles in the workplace? And so one of the greatest biblical principles there is from Genesis to Revelation is the idea of forgiveness, of turning from your ways, of making changes in your life. And we see that throughout the Old Testament, even in the minor prophets, when there's destruction that's pronounced. God says, yet even now, turn to me and you can be blessed. So how do we take this idea of forgiveness, of mercy, of grace? How do we take that in the workplace when we have troubled employees? The thing about it is, as much as we want to have the right culture, and that's the last several of these podcasts we talked about, as much as we want to have the right culture in the workplace, as much as we want to have build an environment where we think we're susceptible for that, right? There's sin at the church, right? We have to deal with congregational discipline. So there's no way we can think that we're not going to have to deal with workplace discipline and workplace forgiveness and employees that just have problems. So how do we take those same principles and apply them to the workplace and not and not destroy that culture that we're working very carefully to build? So let me throw that first question to you, Michael, is what are some initial concerns of, blanket forgiveness in the workplace? If the employee stumbles, commits some sins, has some problems in their personal life, maybe it affects the workplace, maybe it's just personal stuff, but now it's somehow brought into the workplace. What are some pitfalls of just saying, hey, we blanketly forgive everybody?
I don't think I'm being very, very profound here when I say there's some accountability issues, right? That if you do have a culture that believes in certain things and there's a perceived lack of accountability that can have a corrosive effect on the culture. There's also just the simple fact on the other side of the coin that it's the hypocrisy of attempting to have a culture that is built on some Christian fundamentals and then not being graceful and forgiving. The hypocrisy of that is sniffed out pretty quickly. And I think that we can pretty easy to fall into that trap of hypocrisy of, no, this is a business decision. This is completely different. So the balance there of how do you the balance of grace and accountability, and we've touched on that before, but haven't delved into it in great detail. It's there's the same conflict. There's almost a yin and yang thing in my mind. The grace and accountability, that they both have to exist, and if one overpowers the other, there's an imbalance. And And that same conflict exists in the home. I want to give my kids grace and accountability. In the church, there's grace and accountability. So I don't think that it's a uniquely business problem, but obviously because of the nature of what we're talking about, and we're talking about business, it does create conflict, and it creates some hard questions.
Yeah, and let's understand too that there is some fundamental differences between what we look at in the workplace as far as when, for lack of a better term, when the judgment day comes. And the workplace is a lot sooner than, definitely in our lives as Christians, right? The nature of grace is that it's unfair, and essentially, because of the sacrifice of Jesus, we are going to, for to use just a terrible phrase that I never feel comfortable saying, but it's just the truth. We are going to get away with sinning, right? We've committed sin and we are going to get away with it because of the sacrifice of Jesus, right? Jesus is paying that debt for us. And so, at the end sum game of a life as a Christian is that, we are hoping and working diligently towards cleaning our life up and really not paying the cost of our own sin in the broader picture. Now, do we pay individual costs? Absolutely. Right? If I sin against you, then there's some consequences of that sin. We reap what we sow. We understand that part of it. But I think in the workplace, as opposed to a end of life judgment, right, where we have to be accountable for all of our deeds, whether done or undone, at the end of our life with God, with Jesus on Judgment Day. In the workplace, that Judgment Day comes weekly, monthly, quarterly, comes with earnings reports. I mean, it's just I think a lot sooner Judgment Day. And while I think sometimes we focus either on one or another attribute of God, that all the attributes are what's right? So God is merciful and gracious and loving, but also just. So I think we want to forget about the justice of God from sometimes, but other times we focus too much on, the hellfire and brimstone side of it and don't focus enough on grace. I think the truth's always in the middle with balance, right? And I think that's really what we've got to strive to, both in our Christian lives as well as in the workplace, is that there's a balance. But what we also have to understand is that, that judgment day is coming sooner. And sometimes, just like within the church, where there's congregational discipline, and that congregational discipline is, we've got to withdraw some fellowship from you. If you are, and a little leaven leavens the whole lump, right? We know those passages. The same thing happens in the workplace. But instead of withdrawing fellowship, you can't be employed here anymore because you're doing damage to the whole based on your actions, based on your attitudes, based on things that you aren't there. So here's the question I'm going to throw back at you, Michael, is, so help me understand the difference here between forbearance, working through somebody's problems with them, and tolerance, or just outright saying, we're gonna, Bob produces, so we're gonna let him be a jerk.
Yeah. Well, you brought up the parallel between church discipline and I'm going to be careful with that because obviously there's some very obvious not parallels. But one of the things I would note is that the attitude and the reaction of the person who made the mistake is a big deal in terms of what are the effects within the church from a Matthew 18 perspective, and so if you want to kind of and Matthew 18 conflict resolution ain't a terrible thing, even in the workplace, if that's your model. And so if you go to this coworker or employee and have the conversation, and the attitude and the reaction of the coworker is such that they understand and are contrite about it and have a genuine desire to do better, that's far different than one that is belligerent and standoffish. So the reaction of the individual is really important. And I'm struck by what wouldn't this be great if this is the idea? I'm struck by two different things that Jesus said. He said, if you offend a brother, you got to go find them. Before you leave your gift at the altar, you got to go find them. But we also got the biblical principle that it's a glory to overlook an offense. And so both sides of that are a little bit countercultural. And so, the ideal would be the employee comes and, that's before they leave their gift at the altar, so to speak, and says, hey, listen, I've screwed this up and I'm going to make it right. And the employer says it's forgiven. Wouldn't that be like, I know I'm Pollyanna, but that would be the legitimate bringing that biblical idea, because I think that's the way that it's intended to work for Christians. Is if I know if I'm offended somebody, if I know I've offended you again, and I go, hey, Mike, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that to come out that way. Listen, I didn't, I'm going to make this right, and I apologize. And you say, man, I've already forgiven that. That's the Christian interaction, based on, I think based on New Testament teaching. And so I say all that to say the attitude and the reaction of the individual, in my mind, has a lot to do with, is this a Christian-based forgiveness, or is this a turning a blind eye to issues?
So, and I think the other thing in here that we've got to be honest with is that, there's also a performance metric to this, right? That we don't have within the church, right? If I'm a bad song leader, or I'm a bad, opening prayer guy or whatever, I'm not going to get necessarily cut from that list. Now, I may not be up every Sunday. I may be on a 8-week rotation or a 12-week rotation, but then we're not going to be cut from service. But if you're a frontline employee and you screw up every part you touch, I can't keep you on the front line, right? And so, that there is some, and we've all heard this business principle. Anybody that's had classes on this or worked in management, there's two things you can do with a struggling employee, right? You coach them up, or you coach them out. And I think that's that idea of forbearance. Can we, coach you through this? Is this a training issue? Is this a process issue? Like, why do you keep having the same mistakes? And let's try to work through that. I think that's that idea of forbearance, right? Let me work through this with you, versus we can't tolerate the fact that every 5th widget you touch, you break. Like, we just can't do that. We can't make money as a company if you're doing that. So the best thing for you to do is not touch widgets. Let's figure out what you're good at and send you out the door to do that, because this isn't your thing.
Yeah, one of the key distinctions that we should probably mention is, we would never say this obviously about Christianity, but in the workplace, not everybody's a fit. And so it may very well be that the job fit isn't there. And I think both of us would say, from a practical perspective, when we've seen this, that continuing to try to pound that round peg into a square hole is just frustrating for both the employee and the employer. And so if that fit doesn't exist, is it the graceful thing to help this employee find something that fits, whether it's with your organization or elsewhere? And so,
right. Yeah, if you think 2 + 2 is red, you can't work in the accounting department. All right, it's just, I love you. You can be a great guy, but if you can't add, then you can't work in accounting. If you freeze up and are very uncomfortable talking to people or making phone calls, you can't work in the sales department, because that's what the fundamental job is. So, to your point, I think that the gracious thing to do, if we care about somebody, if we truly are vested in that person's best interest, the great thing to do is let's get them out of there, because they're probably miserable, as well as the company's miserable, right? Everybody's miserable in that scenario. And so let's find you something that's going to be rewarding and that you're going to be happy doing.
It's easy to get a little institutional arrogance about that and just be unwilling to give up any employee. So no, we're not going to find you a better fit. We're going to, we're the right place for you, and we're going to, we're going to find a home for you, and just because our brand is, I think it's easy to get institutional arrogance about that and lose sight of the fact that that individual's got a family and got, they've got a whole life that they're trying to uphold personally. And if they are miserable and in a bad fit, it really doesn't matter how great your organization is and your culture is, that it's not great for that person. And so you can't get too institutionally conceited about this is the best place for everybody.
Yeah, and I'm going to say something that may make a lot of our viewers uncomfortable, but it's just the absolute truth on this. The church isn't for everybody either, right? I know that's uncomfortable. We want to say that, but let's talk about who the church is not for. Those that are willfully disobedient, that do not want to submit themselves to God, that do not want to change their lives. The church isn't for you. We could force you to come to church and we could do whatever event to try to draw you in. But if you're not willing to change your life and submit to God and submit to Jesus, the church is not for you. And so, while we, I think make these grandiose statements like there's always a place for it, there's really not. And the same thing in the workplace. There's got to be certain things you've got to be willing to do or able to do in order to find a fit in the workplace. And I think the same things within the church, that there are going to be some that are lost, but it's simply because they, for whatever reason, have decided that they don't want to do the things necessary to be a part of that. Right. And so, that's part of the things we got to come to grips with especially the purveying idea of just blanket grace and mercy for all. That's not really the way it works within the church either, right? That mercy and grace is for those who come and submit in order to receive it. But there's terms, and I think sometimes we get lost in that there's terms of this covenant that we agree to, that God agrees to, and the same thing in the workplace. There's terms of employment that you have to agree to as an employee, and I agree to provide as an employer.
Yeah, I mean, going to provide the caveat to that I know you're thinking, but it probably needs to be said out loud, is the obvious difference is there's not a plan B for the church. And for our organizations, if somebody doesn't fit in our organization, they may fit at the one next door, and it may be better for their life and a better fit. And so the link that you go to, obviously, to try to convince that person to stay is very different. And that would be the obvious difference there, is, the 90 and 9 kind of example. What would God do for that soul? And for that simple reason, that there's not there, there are businesses down the street, and some of them may be a better fit. So it's certainly easier to let somebody go in that scenario. It shouldn't be as painful. But to your point, if there is a demonstrated lack of willingness to fit the role, that the individuals made that decision.
Are you telling me that all my analogies aren't perfect?
I'm just saying that made me a little squishy, and I thought that there had to be just at least some modification.
So great, right? That there are other fits, but even with the 90 and 9, the reason why God's able to bring the sheep back is because the sheep gets in his arms, right? He grabs him and brings him back. But we see throughout the period of the Old Testament where they ran away from God and ended up in captivity.
Yep.
So it's always a choice. But you're right. My overarching point is more so that there's a give and take. As an employer, it's not our job to employ everyone in the county. That's not our job any more than to do everything to save everybody. We can't. There's limited resources and ability and whatnot, but there's got to be that fit. So I don't think we should also see it as a failure if they fit better at place B. I can tell you, at least a half a dozen people that have worked for me in the past that, what we found out, the best thing for them was to move on, and they're happy and successful in their careers and have thanked me, because they probably would have stayed and toughed it out and drowned in the position that they were in, instead of finding something that was more fulfilling and more suited to their skill set. And so, we've got to be, I guess, have the courage of conviction, is what I want to say, to have those very tough conversations with them, to say, I care about you enough as an employee that, this isn't the best fit for you. And maybe we've got some other department in the organization that's a better fit, or maybe, the best thing to do is, let me introduce you to somebody at company B down the street that I think what they do fits a lot better your skill set.
It sounds a little bit like what we're saying. I'd be curious to get your feedback on this, but it sounds a little bit like what we're saying is, competence problems are pretty hard to overcome. If your competency doesn't match your position, that's an issue. What in the church we would call sinful issues, making not competency mistakes but judgment mistakes. That is, I think we would agree that there's a graceful way to get out of competency mistakes. The job's not a fit. Judgment mistakes, not that you can't do the math, but that you're continually making poor moral decisions. That is a little different story, and getting out of those gracefully or finding a position somewhere else is a little trickier.
So let's get down to the brass tacks and the hard part of this with 8 minutes left. So what do you do when the judgment moral mistakes are outside the walls of the company, right? So you got somebody that's not, fudging the numbers in the accounting department, or, misreporting sales, but, their life is a dumpster fire. But they come to work every day and are, relatively good at their job. But outside the walls of the building, I mean, and you can see it as a manager that at some point that's going to affect the work inside, because you can't really separate the two. If your life's a dumpster fire, eventually your work's going to be a dumpster fire too. It's just a matter of when. You can hold it together for so long, but it's just a matter of when. So how do you toe that line of forbearance versus tolerance when it's external to the company?
So there's a personal relationship that is probably necessary to have any kind of substantive conversation there, and that's difficult because for both probably legal and ethical reasons, you can't just start whacking employees for things that happened outside of the office. If it's not affecting performance, even to your point, if you can see it coming down the road, it's not affecting performance. There's both some legal and ethical reasons that you just can't preempt that and make that decision, in my judgment. So you got to have somebody with a relationship that's willing to talk to that person and have a hard conversation. So that, is this going to affect job performance, and is it going to affect culture? And I don't know how you have a valuable conversation on that front without a pretty good relationship. And so it kind of circles back to what we've talked about before in creating a culture. And even if you're on the front line, create a little culture around the circle around you. A history of just being a good human and having relationships with the people around you is got to be valuable. Now, what do you do if that attempt at conversation falls flat and there's not any response or any change? It's a really hard conversation. I'd be interested to hear your feedback.
So I love what you just said there, because that's part of where I was going with this is, what's amazing scripturally is that it all works together, right? You can't take some commands of the Bible and ignore others, because you need those two cohesive units. So what I mean by that is 1 Corinthians 5 and withdrawal fellowship does not work unless you have fellowship, right? So if we get to the point in congregational discipline where we've come to, a member and said, we're going to withdraw from you, and they say, well, what does that mean? Well, that means, we can't go out to eat anymore. Well, we never went out to eat. Well, it means I'm not going to invite you to my house anymore. Well, you've never invited me to your house. We're withdrawing things that didn't exist. So, I mean, what really changes? So if we don't have that part, the other part doesn't work. The discipline part doesn't work. And I think the same thing to your point within the corporate relationship. If you don't have the culture of, we're here, we're a big family, we're working together, we're striving for the best of everybody, then you can't really have that, kind of put my arm around you conversation, right? If you don't have the relationship, you can't have the conversation to say, hey, I care about you, because no, you don't. You never have. I'm just employee number 11206. You don't really care about me. But if you do care about me, now it's genuine when you come. So I'm going to throw a ton of gas on the fire. Does it matter, or do you treat it different, or do you have to treat it different if frontline employee guy, uh, that's entry level employee guy, if he's got a drinking problem, and you can see some mistakes in his life at home, but it hasn't come into the workplace, versus C-suite guy that's got a drinking problem, and that could come into the workplace. Do you have the same conversation with those two, or do you have very different conversations with those two?
And who has the conversation?
Correct. Yeah. Third implied question.
Yeah. I think the general tenor of the question has to be the same. The implications of the answer are very different. The question is, are you trying to protect the business, or are you worried about the individual? If you're worried about the individual, the conversation is pretty similar. But in reality, you're also got business interests in mind, and so the conversation has to be a little different. So there are some core pieces of it that have to be the same, but because leadership has more accountability and a greater impact, there has to be a different business conversation. And as far as who has it, I'm gonna let you tackle that one, because it's challenging also.
So here's the thing. It sounds profoundly unfair that the conversations have to be handled differently, right? Everybody should be the same, but it's not. uh, Entry level employee and C-suite guy don't get paid the same either, right? And with your compensation, you also have some other, implied deals there. You are a face of the company. You are leadership of the company, especially if you're and I use the term C-suite, but I'm talking about officers of a company. People that when they say, that's Joe Smith, he works for XYZ company, he's a vice president, he's representing the company every time he goes out. So, even though you're not, it's in your personal life, that reflects on the company when you're an officer. The guy that is entry level employee, you may work there, but nobody in the community is going to say, oh, well, that must be a terrible company because Joe, their entry level employee, has problems, right? So you've got some perception issues there too. But don't we have the same thing within the church? Don't we discipline preachers, deacons, elders differently than we do other people? And why is it? It's because of the sphere of influence, right? You come to, you know, preachers, teachers, and I think that's part of the scripture. It says, let not many of you be teachers, because yours is a stricter judgment. I would take that same and apply it. Let not many of you be officers of a corporation, because yours is a stricter judgment. Now, again, with officers of a corporation comes a higher pay, but part of that higher pay is that you're never truly off the clock. So
I would add Luke 12:48, whom much is given, much is required. I think that fits there also, but go ahead.
100%. So the other thing is, who's going to be most effective in having that conversation, right? Um, I would think, for entry level employee, probably their, immediate supervisor that's got a closer relationship. I'd say if I'm entry level employee and, 2 levels above my manager are who comes and pulls me into a room, I'm terrified. I don't know that I feel good about that conversation. My manager comes to me, puts his arm around me and says, Joe, love you, do a good job here for me, show up every day, but I'm worried about your personal life, and I'm worried that, it's going to be bad for you in the long run. I think that rings more truer that I care about you versus the guy that comes out of C-suite and may or may not be able to pick me out of a lineup. Officer of the company, C-suite guy of the company, the danger is you've got to have somebody that's got some, leadership above them to have that conversation, because they're depending on their attitude, depending on how they react to that. They, a subordinate would have a hard time talking to them about, problems in their life. Maybe if the relationship's close enough, they can say, look, this as a friend, I'm worried about you. A peer's going to have, I think, going to get some pushback. So you got to have some, somebody with some, if not power over them, at least influence over them. But again, I think all of this stuff, again, goes back to the culture, right? Who has influence over the officers? And have you built a culture that you all influence each other? And it's not really an org chart stack rank, but hey, we're all in this together. How's the culture to find those things? So I think that's the tricky part of it is, who truly does have influence, and can they be influenced? And if they can't, do they belong in the C-suite?
One, and I know time's running short, but one last thing I would add in my long research process preparing for this podcast, if you do take a moment and just kind of Google forgiveness in the workplace, it's interesting that what you'll find is, or at least what I found was, there's not a lot of biblical based or Bible based content, at least that comes to the top of the search. What you find is secular based content that talks about the value of forgiveness in the workplace as a culture building tool, as a mental health improvement tool, and as advocating this as a way to have a healthier work environment. I found that very interesting, that the principles that we talk about and that we believe in from a Bible perspective, is secularly, at least in many instances, secularly, people kind of learn those lessons the hard way and advocate for them with and probably without even realizing that they are like Balaam's donkey. They don't realize they're speaking the words of God, but they are.
That's one of the things that's always amazed me about, self-help books, workplace leadership books. A lot of times when you read these, the secular points they made are biblical principles. I can find proverbs that say the exact same thing. So it's just, it always, every time I come across that, it always just rings true. Like, imagine this, the guy that created us knows how we best function. Like, imagine that, how much easier a lot of our life would be if we, follow biblical principles, because that's how we perform at our best. That's what makes the best versions of ourselves. We can take a circuitous route to get there and, blame it on somebody's story or fable or whatnot. But at the end of the day, it's, there's nothing new under the sun. If it's true, it's been there. And if it's not, then it doesn't work.
But I think that's also interesting to say that some of the things we're talking about, not avoidance and not I forget the word you used, but
Tolerance.
genuine, not tolerance, or just blind tolerance, but genuine forgiveness and forbearance. And maybe we don't think about this side of it enough. We know we're supposed to do it, and we know, and it is hard. You're choosing to eat the debt yourself. It's kind of what forgiveness is, right? But the world would say, even from a secular point of view, the world would say, this is better. They wouldn't say it this way, but it's better for your soul. It's better for your mental health. It's better for your attitude. It's better for your environment. And so, again, that's just one of those points that these commandments aren't grievous. We're not told to do these things, these hard things, just as a test. always, but because in many instances it's God playing the long game with our hearts and our minds, and things are genuinely better for us as people. Um, even the secular world would bear that out.
You know what, when you were saying that, what it made me think about, this is again another one of my terrible analogies, but you think about what we've talked about in building culture and doing these things within the workplace. It is an expensive business model, right? I mean, not only, hard cost, but emotional cost. I mean, it's an expensive business model. It's probably not as streamlined, efficient, lean Six Sigma as, other workplaces that don't take into those account. But, again, the parallel, God's business model is overly expensive, right? The cost for forgiveness is as you pointed out, the cost for forgiveness is borne by the forgiver. So, the cost for our forgiveness is Jesus. That's an expensive business model, but it's worth it. Right? Things that are expensive don't mean that they're bad. Expenses, it's one of my favorite sayings. Expense is relative and only important in the absence of value. That some things are expensive, but they're expensive because it's worth it. And when we run business models that are expensive, the return that we get on those expenses is worth it, because I think it's more than profits. It's building people. And I think we're always going to be blessed. We're always going to be rewarded when our greatest asset are the people that work with us and for us.
Yeah, that building long-term things. I do think that's a biblical principle. Is don't not short-term thinking, but long-term thinking. We've talked about that before. I mean, there's two ways to cook a frozen pizza. I mean, you can pop it in the microwave and hick it up to 700 degrees and burn your mouth, and it's not very good, but you get it quickly. Or you can do it the nice, slow, bring it up to temp slowly, and you got a much better product. So there's my analogy. Frozen pizza, business principles.
Spoken like a guy that spends a lot of time in C-stores. Very good. So let's close on our frozen pizza theology. Again, thank you all for tuning in, for joining us. We are going to the best of our ability, strive to at least do these once a week. I think we can, now that things have calmed down a little bit. I think we can get back to that swing. So again, thank you for tuning in. We hope that these things have given you some stuff to think about, whether you're in management, whether you're employee or anywhere in between, that as you think about how you interact in the workplace and how others interact with you, that it can help you be better and help you on your walk with God. So that's our hope and prayer, that we've given you some things to think about, and that you can be a little bit better for the time that you spent with us this morning.
God bless,
Thank
my
you all.
friend. See you.